Okay, so I want to look with a little more detail into the differences between orality and literacy. And again, the purpose here is to be able to fully appreciate everything that this medium of oral communication allows you to do so that you're using the medium more effectively. I'll give you another analogy. What you can do as a painter is not the same things you can do as a sculptor, right? Every medium of art allows you to do different kinds of things. And so what we want to do here is be very aware of what orality allows you to do, what are its strengths. And when we're comparing orality and literacy, orality is better for some things and literacy is better for other things, right? So every medium is going to have its own strengths and weaknesses. Okay, so let's cover the six things that make orality very distinct from the medium of literacy. And the is first one is that orality is a lot more dynamic and engaging. We have an extensive repertoire of signals in orality. We have our vocal intonations, all the emotions and the rising and falling of the voice that convey a lot of the meaning. Obviously, that does not exist in the written page. We also have gesture, we have facial expression, we have smile, etc. So all of these things mean that the message in orality is being conveyed through a lot more channels, right? A lot of the times there's more meaning in the nonverbal communication than in the content of the actual words. And so there are so many channels of messaging happening simultaneously in orality. Whereas in the written text, really it's boiled down to just simply the words and the ideas. We don't have all of these distractions of, do I like this person? Is this person engaging? Oh, her monotone voice is putting me to sleep. Or the way she's playing with her hair is really distracting. So in orality, there's a lot more going on, right? It's a lot more dynamic. The second thing that makes orality so different from literacy is that it's much more personal. You have that immediacy between the speaker and the audience and the ability to build rapport with your audience members. You have the ability to build this instantaneous connection. Part of this is because the communication is simultaneous, right? Even though only one person is speaking, the audience members are giving energy back to the speaker. They're giving the energy nonverbal communication, nonverbal cues, which help affect the communication as it's going. The speaker might adapt to the audience because she notices that the audience is confused or doesn't understand something. So there's this constant exchange of communication. It's more of a two-way street. Whereas when you're writing, you have your imagined audience. You can't see their reactions in real time. And so we have this intimacy, this connection. In a lot of written formats, you're not even allowed to use the first person I. For example, in a lot of scientific forms of writing, you're supposed to play the role of the objective observer with the God's eye view. And so you don't mention your I in the research paper. You say the authors of this report. Talk about impersonal, right? In orality, it's always fine to say I, to say we. And great speakers often really get their audience involved, and they'll use a lot of plural pronouns like we. Ronald Reagan was great with this. He would often say things like, you and I both know, right? And even though he was communicating via television, it felt like you had this intimacy with him, like he was in your living room. So the third thing I want to cover about how orality is so different than literacy is it's much simpler. It's much less precise. The vocabulary we use in the spoken word is much, much, much more limited than the vocabulary we use in the written word. There are many words that we use in writing that we would never say out loud. They sound ridiculous out loud. Or there are words that we read that we comprehend just fine when we see them on the written page, but we would never use them ourselves when we're speaking. And so because we have a much bigger vocabulary in literacy, it can be a lot more precise. The other thing is that when you're speaking extemporaneously, you often forget the word that you want in that moment, right? So in the first video in this series, I wanted to say that you channel Barack Obama. As you're reading that, I was going to say, if you channel Barack Obama and you imagine his voice, this will look perfectly normal to you as an oral message. But I couldn't think of the word channel in that instant, and so I had to go with an inferior word that wasn't as precise as I wanted. This happens constantly when we're speaking, right? I'm sure it's happened to you before as well. You have to use the word that comes to mind in the moment. When you're writing, you have the luxury to pause, to stop, to use the thesaurus, to think about what will be the perfect word for that sentence. And so the written language has higher expectations. It's much, much more precise. And people are going to be more forgiving in oral communication because they know you don't have that extensive range of vocabulary. So a lot more precise and a lot more detailed in written communication. Part of this simpleness of orality is also that there's a limit to how much people can take, right? So we have short attention spans. It's hard to listen to messages. And so you have to keep your messages simple. This becomes more and more of a problem as time goes on, and our attention spans get worse and worse. There was a time, when you go back to the Lincoln-Douglas debates, that people would sit all day long and listen to these two men speak day after day, right? So people could listen to speeches for hours and hours. In today's world, we don't have that capacity anymore, and so you have to keep your messages simple. On that note, let me move to the next main idea. The orality is also a lot less formal, and it's more cluttered. Writing conventions are very strict. You can't start a sentence with, I was, and then stop and go back to something else, right? So in natural extemporaneous speech, we often don't speak in complete sentences. We have clutter in the form of vocalized pauses, such as, right? That's my favorite one, right? So we have all of this clutter in our speech that would never exist in the written format. Now, in a speech, a little bit of clutter might be okay because it's going to help humanize you to your audience. It's going to help them relate to you. And so let me give you an example of that. When I saw Hillary Clinton's speech, I told some of you that I saw her speaking from a teleprompter, but she would pepper her speech with things like, you all know what I mean, right? And that just made it sound like a much more natural conversation, right? Clearly, you're not going to write, you all know what I mean, right? In a written essay, right? But this kind of thing in orality can help humanize you. That said, if you have way too much clutter, for example, you say, right, after every single sentence, right, 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 then it becomes a tick that's just distracting from the message. And so a little bit of clutter can be a good thing in orality if it's not too much. The fifth major difference I want to talk about is that orality is more redundant. We're going to repeat ourselves more often in orality. This happens for a variety of reasons. Number one, if I'm speaking really extemporaneously and I'm trying to imagine what my next thought is going to be, I might just repeat what I just said in different words. So we saw an example of that just now with the Barack Obama quote, where he said something like, they haven't seen their incomes go up. They haven't seen their wages go up. That kind of repetition is going to be much more common in extemporaneous speech. And you know what? It's okay. Because number one, audiences like that repetition. And this is for the sixth reason, but that repetition makes it more musical. It makes it more like the refrain of a song that repeats. And so the ear doesn't mind repetition at all. On the written page, it looks ridiculous, but the ear likes it. So it's okay for that reason. And the second reason is that that kind of repetition will help audiences retain the main ideas. So we talked about this in the unit with arrangement, but the listener of a speech doesn't have the luxury of going back to reread. And so we want more repetition in oral presentations, because the audience members, or at least some of them, probably didn't get the idea the first time around. And so there's a lot of repetition just to drive home the message. So some of this repetition happens because we're just thinking where we're going next. And some of it happens very intentionally because we want to review material for the audience. And then the final reason that I want to cover is that orality is a lot more musical and rhythmic. Because it's processed through the ear, we like these very simple stylistic things that we're going to study later when we get to the canon of style. But we like things like repetition. We like things like antithesis. All of these figurative devices that we'll get to later in the class are much more pleasing to the ear than they are to the eye. And that's because orality has more in common with music than does literacy. And so keep all these things in mind, that all of this is processed through the ear, and that's what makes orality quite different. Okay, so I quickly covered just 6 things that I think are key differences between the written and the spoken word. What I'm hoping to do with our discussion forum this week is for you to elaborate on these things. So you might respond to some of the things I just said. You might go into more depth. I covered it sort of superficially, and so you can expand upon this, go into more depth. And I'm looking forward to the discussion this week. Okay, hope you're having a great day. See you later.